The night was patient above the north, a long-breathed thing, drawing in the cold and releasing it again over the forests, the fens, the bar-rollins where old kings slept, and the rugged spine of mountains where the wind sang like a bone flute. Stone kept its counsel, iron remembered the hands that had clenched it, and the trees talked quietly among themselves in the language of leaves and sap. Far beneath the surface, water moved with a gentle warmth through secret channels, threading the layers of the world as surely as memory threads the days of a life. And by that warm water, where the earth carried the pulse of deep fires, rose a fortress of gray hands joining, tower clasped to tower, a home of banners and ravens and wolves. Here, hearth smoke drifted blue through winter air. Here, under a red-faced tree with eyes like wounds and wisdom, the stories began and returned, like footsteps that never end. In those first stories, the world itself is still rubbing sleep from its eyes, and men are new to the soil they claim. They come from across the narrow passages of sea and sound, bringing bronze and stubbornness, naming hills and rivers with breath that steams and fades, yet leaves the name behind as a hook in the land. The trees are older than men. The stones are oldest of all. Between them walk beings the later ages will half remember and half deny, small and sure-footed in the undergrowth, with the craft of shaping light into whispers and the gift of binding a forest to a promise. The men who come learn to make their oaths sturdy in such company, for the trees will hold a vow in their red rings and whisper it forever to any ear that will listen. The heart of that companionship is a pact made with blood and bowls of sweet water, carved into living wood by hands careful as love. Let the groves be sacred, the rivers run free, the faces in the bark keep watch. Let men live where they will, but not take more than they can carry in their arms and their songs. In that pact, an enduring house finds its shape, although neither name nor crown has settled on it yet. It has only the sound of wolves, the gesture of a hand set on a child's shoulder in warning, and the calm of stone that means to outlast the restlessness of ages. Winter, being winter, one day forgets to end. It stretches itself and grows old without spring. The sky pale as milk, the rivers locked and singing. Creatures that are not merely hungry but remembering hunger from the first night begin to walk the empty white. In the howl of those nights, a boy becomes a builder. He learns by feeling the granite's grain under his palm and by listening to what wind says when it arrives from the farthest north. He learns that the earth keeps secrets and that some of them wish to remain kept. He will raise walls in two directions. One around a hearth, to keep a family safe, and one that runs like the backbone of the world, to keep everything that forgets kindness on the far side of memory. The walls go up with help from those who speak to stone in a manner of hands and songs, with help, too, from giants whose footsteps measure patience, and the hidden children whose craft wraps the mortar in unseen strength. He is called Brandon by his people, the name a river-carried thing, and he leaves behind more than buildings. He leaves a way of living, a posture of the heart before the winter, a habit of looking to the horizon not with fear, but with care. Where the ground breathes warmth, the first halls by the hot springs are set. Stone forms arcs like cupped palms, and passages under the earth fold gentleness into bitter nights. Someone lays a wolf on gray cloth and says, "Let this be our sign, not for boasting, but for remembrance." A creature of quiet ferocity, who keeps its own and endures storms while wasting no bark on thunder. Beneath the red-faced tree in the godswood, they cut the first steps of the crypt. Not a place of gloom, not truly. A place where hands can touch history and feel the same chill, the same duty that reaches out of the stones. Men and women go down to lay their dead and come up heavier with inheritance. The living and the departed keep each other warm that way. Seasons turn like the slow wheel of a millstones, and with them the house hardens into itself. The kings of winter rise and rest in their courses, stern as the season for which they are named, even in favorable times. Their banners do not shout. Their victories are not sung with riot. They conquer by holding fast. There are other northern lords who wear red mail and laugh as though cruelty were wine. There are kings who build mounds upon mounds of bones and wear bracelets of teeth. The wolf is different. It circles and watches. If it bites, it does so cleanly. When the cold hunts, The wolf knows to share meat and to search the snow for the lost. Houses grow up around it. Houses of reed and marsh, of mountain and bear, of lonely island where the sea strikes hard enough to carve iron into patience. To the east, a family breaks away and stakes a hall where the river curves, and an old name is turned new with a single letter, because that is how things endure in the north, not by forgetting, but by folding old meaning into fresh life. In the shadow of the Dreadfort's red memory, wolves and flayed men test one another too many times to count. Sometimes wolves are forced to smile with bared teeth. Sometimes they are pushed to the edge of their own quiet. Yet the fortress by the hot springs remains, between the woods and the world, a stone with a steady pulse. Snow lies with a hand's weight on the pines when messengers carry word that dragons have come south like streaks of fire across a night sky. The young king who hears this knows that there is a way to lose everything in a single proud heartbeat, and there is a way to bend and keep life. He looks north at the long wall men made against the dark, looks south at smoke that could be a promise or a warning, and he chooses to kneel so that his people can remain themselves. A crown is lighter in a chest than on a brow, and it can be kept that way for a better season. It is not surrender that the stone remembers. It is a courtesy given to a power that will not last, so that the enduring things may endure. The kneeling is not easy. Nothing in the north worth doing is ever easy. But once it is done, the river of years carries the realm forward, and in that current the house learns to be lord as well as king, caretaker as well as conqueror. There are southern wars in which northern spears shine like hoarfrost at sunrise. A boy named Cregan grows into the weight of Winterfell's timber and rock and looks upon a realm eaten hollow by dragons fighting their own reflection. He rides with the cold at his back and the law in his hands. He stands in a hall where the air still smells faintly of ash and insists that truth arrive like clean snow over footprints. For a short, sharp hour, the wolf hand closes over the realm's throat and bids it breathe evenly. The hour passes. The wolf returns to colder hills. But the world remembers that the north, when roused, is like a river under ice. It can look still until it breaks its covering, and then it is a force no man can hold. Years tread their circles. Sands in southern castles burn and flow. The north plows, hunts, mends, weathers. Ladders are frozen and loosened, roofs red-hatched, arrows fletched with feathers that smell faintly of the bird's last wind. Raiders from Iron Islands test the shorelines, and are taught, saltwater or not, that there is always a colder sea in a northern arrowhead. Fur-lined cloaks are hung to dry over stone basins where the hot spring breath breathes steadily, like a low song against the skin. Children run the covered walkways with sticks as swords, and a heavy bell marks changes of day that sometimes look alike until you get close enough to notice that no two snowflakes share the same shape. The names roll along. The names do not beat like drums. They murmur. Ricard, who looks south with the curiosity of a man who wonders if the realm might, after long winter, learn to share a single harvest without jealousy. He sends children to foster with the mountain birds, so that the wind can teach them one kind of courage while the quiet halls teach another. Brandon, bright and fierce as frost sparkling in the first light. Lyanna, a laugh like a hoofbeat and the calm of a rider who knows where a horse places each foot before the foot is placed. Eddard, with a strength that looks like restraint to men who mistake shouting for command, with a habit of going to the godswood when other men would go to a wine cup. Ben-Jen, with the wall in his bones and a willingness to give his years to the watch without asking for any return beyond the watch itself. Names join to names, and with them, the house thickens like stew left to its patient purpose. A king burns a father while the city shouts for spectacle, and a son chokes himself trying to save what cannot be saved. Flames reach for air and find screams. Chains cool slowly with no hand to unfasten them. Elsewhere, in a high hall shaped like a falcon's flight, a lord chooses to take sons in as sons and not as pieces on a board. Oaths break like poor ice. Oaths hold like roots. A war gathers. The North answers not because it loves war, but because the measure has been called, and a measure must be met. The wolf rides in company with a stag and an eagle, and the sound they make together becomes a song men will sing with mugs around fires, even if the singers themselves do not understand the cost of the tune. In the heat of that rising, a prince and a girl walk a path that cuts through everyone else's maps. Whether it is love or madness, whether it is a flower opening toward a storm, the result is the same. Riders fall, banners topple, and when the dust leaves its last grain in the air, a brother finds a sister in a high tower with the smell of birth and blood around her, and she, fading but fierce, puts a trust in his arms that rings like the plainest of oaths. He carries that trust home in silence and risks misunderstanding because silence is lighter to bear than betrayal. Cold men will accuse him. Warm men will praise him. He will not be altered by either, for the child in his arms is an answer to a question he will never ask aloud. Peace returns the way summer does in the north, by degrees with a suspicion of its own warmth. The house sets its rhythm again. Eddard takes a wife out of duty and then honors her beyond the limits of duty until duty itself begins sounding like affection. Children hang from the arms of chairs and from each other. They have faces that are, in their early years, a soft combination of all the faces that came before them. A bastard boy grows, too, with watchfulness in him, and a melancholy kindness that fits the stone around him so well it might have been carved there. The yard fills with the even clack of wooden swords. The godswood takes in the size of a lord who is doing sums tallied in honor and debt. On winter mornings, when the steam from the hot pools curtsies along the low branches, the girls are quick-footed and curious. The boys dream of a sky full of banners, as boys do. A small child loves climbing more than walking and looks at towers as if they were ladders given by the world for his particular joy. If a raven croaks, head cocked, it is because the bird knows how soon the simple pattern of days can be broken. A king arrives like a storm that laughs and embraces. There is a smell of leather, horse, roasted meat, and long-parted friendship. The yard makes way for a great man with a greater appetite who sees in his old friend a steadiness he cannot find in himself. He asks for that steadiness to be put in service to all the realm, and the asking is both trust and trap. The walls of Winterfell do not approve or refuse. They only listen. In the space between a promise and a farewell, lives alter their courses. A girl takes the south for a dance floor. Another girl packs herself like a blade in a boot and steps into streets that do not care what banner her father flies. A boy climbs because he cannot not climb. The fall is a tilt the world takes to remind people that what is high can be lower than you dreamed in a heartbeat. There is a hand that pushes and a wind that whispers. The truth, when it is finally known, proves how enduring stone can be when struck with the right guilt. South is a different kind of winter, made of courtesies that cut and shadows that seem like shelter until you remember they move with the sun and leave you exposed. The wolf wears furs in a hall full of silk and understands that he is both necessary and unwelcome, and that being necessary will not save him when the wheel decides to rid itself of grit. His uprightness is a threat in a place that treats truth as a costume. When the headsman's sword finally takes what it has no right to take, the sound does not carry to the north, but something more lasting does. The quiet patience of the wolf turns to rage that is not noisy, to a grief that knows how to lift a spear and keep the hand from shaking. Robb takes a crown that is older than the words men spill to justify it, and he takes it with the solemnity of someone accepting a cloak he has not grown into yet but will not let drag in the dirt. Banners rise from 100 cold valleys like birds startled from the same tree. Old grievances stretch their legs. A boy who was foster brother to a king hears the sea calling and answers in the worst possible way, as if changing banners could change what a man owes to the hand that fed him. Winterfell is taken not by force greater than stone can bear, but by need and by a young heart that thought power and home could be demanded in the same breath. Flames lick along roofs while the hot springs keep breathing under the foundations like a patient grandfather who cannot be roused into excitement nor grief. In that blaze, 2 small bodies are claimed by rumor and the blackened hush of a ruined hall, and the north carries a wound that will trouble its walking for years, though the truth of it is a different stone entirely. Far away, a girl learns to keep her face still while her soul runs for its life. She learns where to put the courtesy knife and when to bite into sweetness so that poison knows it has failed. She learns the laws of a high nest and how to watch a lake without seeing her reflection in it. She learns to make allies out of people who have never known loyalty except to their own ambition. Her songs become quieter, but their words become truer. The world tries to write her story for her. She puts the quill to work with her own small, steady hand and adds lines they do not expect. Another girl becomes a thrush on the wing, crossing water, stepping into a city of coins and shadows, learning to be no one so that she can someday be someone more precisely than she ever could have been. She peels her heart back to its hardest kernel and then learns, little by little, to clothe it again in feeling that is chosen rather than inherited. North again. A boy carried beyond the wall walks among the trees with a dreamer's gait. The air is so clean it seems to have edges. He goes farther than maps on tables ever dare to follow, beyond a wind that brings old words to the ear, and finds a place under the earth where time sits still and hallucinates. There he learns that memory is not a simple ledger but a river that forks, flows backward, saturates the ground beneath the roots of everything. He touches moments as if they were beads and finds that touching changes them, and that change, once begun, is a patient frost that reaches far. He sees an old stable boy of a man hold a door until it becomes his name. He sees himself from behind as if he were his own shadow. He understands that being the witness of all things is not the same as being their master, and he takes that understanding into his bones with the same quiet that his forefathers used to take their vows. Rob rides to his ruin with standards flying, each thread of cloth a promise and a gamble. Hospitality is made a mockery of in a hall where the music sounds thin because the players are frightened and the meat tastes like a bargain that has already been paid for with something dear. Knives slide where toasts should rise, and the wolf song is cut short. The river takes bodies and gives back headlines no raven is brave enough to deliver at once. What remains of the scattered family scatters farther, snow shaken from a cloak. It is in this scattering that the house shows its old magic, not fire or spellcraft but a stubbornness akin to stone, a way of bending without breaking, of hiding like seeds under snow so deep even the plowmen do not remember the map of the field. At the edge of the world on a wall the builder's hands began. The bastard boy grows into responsibility he never requested, the sort that fits him because it is heavier than he is. He learns to hear more in a scream than fear, to hear the cadence of hunger and the beat of hope beneath it. The free folk who come south carry their own music and their own debts. He listens and spends the soft currency of trust, which buys more than cold steel does on a true winter night. He gives up safety so that other men's children may keep theirs, and for that generosity his brothers at the wall repay him with the smallest currency a frightened heart knows, a knife where the ribs are thin. He dies with the astonishment of a man who had believed in people a little more than is safe, and returns with that belief scarred but unbroken, called back by fire and an obstinate promise he never got around to putting into words. There are battles where women and men stand shoulder to shoulder and the sound of their fear is held in check by the nearness of one another. There is a battle in a white place W. Here the snow seems to be listening, and the enemy is not a banner but the end of breath itself. Fire sputters and stubbornly catches. Steel breaks, men's breaks again. The living lean into the living as if they can lend their heartbeat for a moment. The dead are led by a figure that is not a name so much as a mood of the world, an intention toward quiet. He has waited since the winter that forgot to end. He is patient. He thinks patience is victory. But the living are patient, too patient in a warmer way, a way that has to do with stories told to children and children grown into fighters who still remember the cadence of those stories. A girl who learned to be no one learns that being someone is the sharpest tool she owns, and in a single motion she retains the right of spring to arrive. When breath returns to human chests like guests who were late to a feast, the night is not over, but a line has been drawn that even winter will eventually respect. Stone remembers the trampling of hooves that circle and circle a field in which a young lord refuses to let his terror become his master. He charges anyway, becomes a small dark figure on snow, a point of grief and courage that every eye is dragged toward. The circle closes. The men who loved him run with blades peeled back to bone. They are rescued by a calculation made in secret and a commitment born in suffering. A sister returns to the home that gave her name and discovers that to guard it, she must set aside the last of the softness that had once been her birth. She learns command as one learns to tie a knot. Awkwardly at first, then with a feeling of the right tension, and then with the calm that comes from trusting that the knot will hold even when the rope is wet. In the south, a queen who believes herself entitled to flame gives it to the city like a vulgar gift, and the city takes it, because cities are not good at refusing what is offered in strength. Stone fractures into dust. Bells ring. Some mean surrender, some mean grief, some, rung by hands that will never ring again, mean only noise. A man who has loved the queen and loved the realm must weigh one love against another and find that the realm is made of many rooms, and each room contains a child or an old man or a girl who is not finished becoming herself, and that this is the only arithmetic that matters. He does what wolves do when fire is licking the edges of the forest and the pups are near. He chooses the pack's continuance over the comfort of lying down. He goes north again, where he is allowed to be useful without being celebrated, and the usefulness is more bed than any feather mattress ever was. In a council chamber built to be a stage on which the realm pretends to unite, the wolf's eyes, once in the boy who fell and learned the language of the roots, look out without haste. He knows the stories because they live in him now. He knows the parts that cannot be broken by pretty speeches. When voices argue, he remembers a tower lifted stone by the patience of people who would never see its upper windows. He allows himself to be chosen not because he wants the choosing but because the realm, for once, has had the sense to choose a witness instead of an actor. He will not blush with pride. Pride is for men who think the world began with their own name days. He will instead turn the wheel slowly, carefully, hand over hand, until it spins in the direction where bread and testimony are easier to come by than blood. The sister who learned to keep her face still stands in a hall that has known wolves since there were wolves. She wears not the South's jewels but the North's gravity and speaks aloud a truth that even the stones have been waiting to hear. Some things are themselves and will remain so. A kingdom that had been folded into a larger claim unfolds like a letter kept under a hearthstone. The wax seal breaks with a sound no one can hear but everyone understands. The North returns to being the North. It is not a loud independence. It is a steady one, the kind that lives in the way a person pours water into a cup without wasting a drop. Another sister, who counted steps on far bridges and learned the arithmetic of anonymity, turns west because the map refuses to tell the whole truth and because discovery is not an act of conquest but an act of knitting the world more tightly together. She watches the line between sea and sky like a seamstress watching the place where cloth meets thread. She pedals away into horizon until horizon has to move to make room for her. In doing so, she becomes what she once pretended to be. A ghost in some hearts, a story in others, a constant pilgrim to the places where maps grow thin. In the deep places under Winterfell, the kings and lords lie in their stone beds with wolves at their feet. They are not jealous of the living. They have their own work to do, which is to keep silence company and to hold the memory of vows in the cool of their resting place. Candles burn there sometimes when someone needs to say a name aloud to remember what it once meant. The flames push small domes of light out into the dark, and the dark receives them, impressed momentarily as if by a gentle finger. The familiar names arrive with different feelings now. Brandon of the first walls, Torrin of the kneeling, Cregan of the brief stern hour, Ricard of the wrong fire, Brandon of the fast heart, Lyanna of the wild laughter, Eddard of the steadiness, Robb of the winter crown. The living add to these names with their own. Sansa who ruled because someone must rule and chose to do it well. Arya who walked and returned to tell the sea what a wolf's step sounds like. Bran who sees because someone must see, even when seeing is hard. Jon who loved the realm enough to lose his place in it and found a new place that needed him. The seasons do not stop. They are the true kings of the North. Leaves redden, drift, and rot. Snow inscribes delicate scripts and then else away, making little tongues of water that lick stone and root. Children are born with eyes that do not yet know what they will behold. Far out on the flats, where the sky is the roof men live under without complaint, a line of travelers makes small punctuation marks along the edge of a weather front. The man leading them is simple in his needs. He wants shelter for others more than he wants fame for himself. A white wolf trots at his side, a companion out of a story people will pretend is not true even as they tell it. In Winterfell, the first thing you notice is always the heat. Not a heat that boasts, a hearth warmth that slides along the skin and tells the blood not to hurry. Steam from the springs drifts under the covered ways, and the air smells faintly of iron and wet fur. Hammers ring against anvils at measured intervals. One cannot rush good iron with shouting. The god's wood receives footsteps like a pond receives a fallen leaf. The face in the tree is as it has always been, watching without complaint, remembering without malice, a witness to every oath and every breaking. Sometimes the king goes there, the one whose realm is made of memory. Sometimes the queen goes there, the one whose realm is made of consent. They do not speak loudly there. In that quiet, the house listens to itself breathing. Beyond the walls, in every direction, are people connected to the wolves as threads are to cloth. On Bear Island, mothers tell daughters how to string a bow while keeping a baby from rolling into the fire. The baby laughs because it trusts the hands that catch it every time. On a cold marsh, a boy learns to move as if he were wind's younger brother, stepping where the reed roots knit strongest, and he grows into a man who can hide a host in a fog bank. In a longhouse where the roof sags under snow like a tired shoulder, elders speak of years when the flayed men came close and the wolves came closer, and the children listen with that solemn fascination which is half fear and half longing for their turn at courage. In a smaller hall to the east, where a name branched from the parent trunk like a river from a river, the Lord counts winter stores and sends more to Winterfell than the letter asked, because generosity is cheaper than regret when the weather goes harsh again. What gentles this house, beneath the sternness, is not victory but care. It has always been so. Once, a king of the line wrestled a man for an island because he preferred to stake strength on one pair of arms rather than on a fleet that would drown too many. He won because the North favors the straightforward. He gave the island to a family who loved the bear's ferocity and the mother's guard dog heart, and the island paid back that gift in every generation with men and women who could be trusted with a wall at their back. Once, another Stark extinguished a branch of his own tree because the rot had gone too far. He did it without theater, then spent the evening in the godswood, making himself remember the cost of all pruning. There are victories so clean they leave no stain. More often there are victories that ask to be cleaned. The North cleans them without complaint, because the North keeps a memorious eye on the long run of things. It is easy to make a house into a collection of noisier stories. Campaigns, beheadings, declared loyalties, marriages that were doors instead of windows. But if you listen in Winterfell on an ordinary morning, you hear the better song. The cooks quarrel about salt. A groom hums while picking ice from a horse's tail. A steward scratches a record into a wax tablet about grain that must be moved before the river hardness returns. In a tower, a child reads aloud to a younger child, stumbling over words that will soon be worn smooth by use. The old maester sleeps in his chair and dreams of a boy walking under roots, and his breath rattles very slightly, like paper in a soft draft. These are the notes of a hall that intends to last. They are the counterpoint to banners. Without them, even the grandest household is a drum played only to be heard by itself. If you look at the crypt's long corridors, each with its sleeping lord and its stony wolf, you might imagine that the house is over. That is what such places can make you think. The neatness of rest suggests a closing. But the truth is that the line continues as the hot water continues under stone, and heat does not end so much as move from body to body. The present inheritors are not better than their predecessors. They are no worse. They are weathered by a different weather. They know things the old ones did not, what ice looks like when it walks like a man, how a queen can be warmer and sterner than a king, how a girl can be a whisper that kills and then a laugh that opens windows. They also do not know what the old ones knew, how to swing a greatsword with one hand while holding honor in the other as if honor had weight and heft and could be balanced. That is fine. Houses are not built to know everything. They are built to keep enough wisdom in reserve that each generation has something to spend when the season turns. There will be a season, because there is always a season, when the snows return as if they had been away only a day and had forgotten a scarf. The doors will frost at the corners. Ravens will puff themselves until they look twice their size. The northern lights will burn and twist, silent banners given by no lord. People will count their supplies and remake their habits. In those days, Winterfell will light more fires. The queen will take more quiet counsel from those who know the counts of grain and the counts of hearts. The king will close his eyes and look backward and outward in equal measure, then reopen them with a small nod that might mean that he has seen enough for now. The rangers will range. The children will be kept from the upper walks during high wind. The dogs will sleep closer to the hearth and smell faintly of singed hair. In every village and outpost, people will speak the old house words even if they do not think of them as belonging to a house at all. They will speak them because such words are not a threat. They are a reminder that the world keeps appointments whether we have prepared for them or not. And after that winter, there will be a spring that stands a little dazed in the doorway, blinking at how much work there is to do. Snowmelt will make the fields a temporary map of shining lines. The beehives will hum as if they had kept their own counsels all winter and decided to forgive the world again. Lovers will make promises by riverbanks that look like polished steel, and those promises will be broken or kept for the same old reasons. Because people are strong and weak in turns, and because the reasons were built into them by 1,000 mornings of small choices at tables where bread is sliced with a common knife. The house will grow by that as well, less by births and fealties than by these slight adjustments of soul that make a family of everyone who has eaten from the same loaf. Sometimes at dusk, when the gray light wraps itself around parapets and the ravens arrange themselves like punctuation along the rookery's lines, you can hear a song coming from the kitchen yard that might be old or might have been made that moment, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the North the North. The singer is a woman who once held a wooden sword and now holds a broom with the same sureness, or a man who once swung a real sword and now finds his hands steadier on a ladle. The song, if you listen to it, tells the story of a family that was a kingdom that learned to be a family, a place that was both in different weather. It tells of a tree that learned to drink the memory of 1,000 vows, of a girl whose feet went away and came back speaking ocean, of a boy whose eyes learned to count backward until they reached the first fire. It tells, without heat, of heads that fell and hands that held and bodies that went into the earth like letters into a well-worn box. There is a plan to place more stones where the old fires burned Winterfell's skin. The masons talk in a gentle dialect of measurements and cure times. They do not hurry the mortar, which has never been persuaded to strengthen faster by impatience. The plan calls not only for the made things but for the planted things, the trees that will one day give shade to a boy who has not yet been imagined, the herb beds whose scent will be the hallway's second heartbeat, the grapevines that may or may not take to the northern soil but will be tried because someone insisted on trying. In this soft insistence is the house's genius. It does not claim the world, cultivates it. And beyond all of this, beyond stone and hot water and the careful keeping of books about grain and steel, there is the way a person's breath rises visibly from their mouth on a cold night in the yard. Each breath is briefly a cloud over the head, briefly a ghost fleeing a body before it is called back in by the next inhalation. If you watch enough people breathing in the dusk, you will begin to see the house itself breathing, a single creature made of 1,000 converging lives, each with its own sorrows and small satisfactions. You will see that what they guard is not a title. It is the shape they make together at the edge of the world, a shape that tells the dark there is something here worth its own shadow. So the history runs on, not with drums or trumpets, but with the slow tread of people who know their work and take it up each morning. There will be a day when a child whose name has yet to be chosen runs his hand along the stones of a new stair and feels a familiar warmth and thinks, without knowing why, that he is home. He will ask who first built these walls, and someone will tell him a name that tasted of frost even then. He will ask who made his queen and his king, and someone will name people who were children once, as he is, and who found that duty becomes a second skin in time, soft enough not to chafe if you accept it without self-pity. If you sit long enough beside the red-faced tree, you can almost hear the older voices under the youngest ones. They are not separate. They are a single choir layered by time. The voices say that the world is old and fresh, that snow and leaf take turns on the ground, that houses endure not by building higher towers but by remembering which doors to leave unlatched so neighbors can come in at night. They say that the wolf is a sign not of hunger but of belonging, a creature that knows its circle not by offense but by scent and footfall and love. They say that winter does not come. It is welcomed, the way you would welcome a truth that keeps you careful. And when the fire at last swims low in its cradle, the logs giving only red eyes and the occasional sigh, the story seems to rest of its own accord. Nothing urgent pulls at its sleeve. If you lean back and close your eyes, the warmth on your face remains. The walls stand, the springs breathe, the ravens settle. On a parapet, a watchman rolls his shoulders under fur and draws a deeper breath than the last, thinking of the room with its coarse blanket and the heat that will have assembled there by the time he is off his watch. In the Godswood, snow dusts a red leaf. Somewhere west, a ship noses into a dusk that was not on anyone's chart. Somewhere far north, light runs along the sky like a silent messenger. Inside the halls, the house sleeps and does not, wakes and is not hurried. Nothing in it strains to be beyond its nature. Stone, water, wood, blood, memory, promise. The old alchemy works by patience. The wolf does what wolves have always done. Guards, grieves, endures, loves. The north is a hand warmed by a long cup of tea, emptied now and set aside for the morning, when it will be filled again without ceremony. In that cycle, the house keeps fate, with everything that has ever asked to be sheltered. And so the tale of the Starks, ancient and ongoing, lies down beside the fire and closes its eyes, not finished, only resting, like the land itself beneath a white, forgiving sky. In the morning after such a rest, the embers in the hall still hold their orange cores. Small suns the fire left behind to show it intends to return. A draft moves through the quiet like a careful hand lifting the corner of a blanket, and somewhere a single pot simmers in the kitchen. The sound is steady as a heartbeat heard through a wall. The tale opens its eyes again to the soft light that comes late in the north and leaves late when it can. And the old stone takes the weight of another day as if it knows that each day is simply a different name for the same duty. The work of rebuilding taught fingers a new patience. Stones were lifted back into place, and those that would not fit were turned, tested, and set aside without fuss, like thoughts a person saves for a better hour. The masons talked to one another in measurements that sounded almost like lullabies. Spans and courses, plumb and true, time for mortar to cure, time for timber to settle. Roof beams went up with the slow confidence of trees finding the light again after a long winter. Lead flashed along seams against the slyness of rain. Children watched from doorways, eating hot apples that steamed in their palms, and called out each time a hammer rang different on the nail head. Because even a child knows that music is a sign that a thing is being made right. Under the Queen's hand, the house grew in the way a well-tended garden grows, not by sudden leaps but by a leaning toward its best self. Laws were written with care and read with more care, the ink drying on crisp sheets that smelled faintly of flour and wood smoke. Bounties encouraged men to trap not too much of one creature, nor too quickly. In the markets, wool was weighed on scales that had been tested against a set of stones kept under lock not for their value but for their honesty. The guest right was a shape carved into every new doorframe, a simple pattern of wheat and salt and cup, quiet reminders to a land that knew too well what it meant to be betrayed under a roof. Councils were held often and lasted longer than songs. In them, men who had once thought a woman's command would rasp on the ear found it soothed like balm applied to windburn. Decisions set with that calm did not wobble when the season changed. White Harbor sent grain north and boats down to Nets Bog and up again with smoked eels tied in neat cords, the waxed twine smelling of river water. The Manderleys built a new lighthouse that threw its eye farther than the old one, and its turning gaze felt like a promise made in light instead of words. At Barrowton, the Hill of Kings held its same old silence while the town around it learned to mend harness faster and to pack salt more tightly into green hides without wasting, because time, like salt, works best when applied evenly. On Bear Island, girls grew into command as naturally as a hand closes around a hilt. They stood in doorways with their mothers and spoke about sailcloth and storm signs and the right knots to tie when someone is too tired to remember. On the lonely headlands, men who had lost more than men should lose learned to measure a good day by the way a pot of soup smells when lifted from a slow fire, and by the number of neighbors who stopped to share it without asking. The lands near the wall softened around the edges in those years without letting their character blur. Eastwatch took on the smell of fish and tar again. Men mended nets on the stones where once they had mended armor. The stairs down to the water were scrubbed free of ice, and a small bell was hung where a lantern had once swung in harsh winds. When that bell rang on foggy mornings, it sounded like a copper coin tapped lightly on a table. The watch did not end. It changed shape. Black cloaks could still be seen on the high walkways, but the men inside them spoke more often of maps and less often of raids. Ravens carried messages that were not orders but requests for stories of weather and wildlife, and for advice about the best places to plant windbreaks. The forests were walked, not marched through. Simple shrines were made of piled stones in a dozen glades. They marked not gods but gratitude, and people left their small things they could spare. A curl of birch bark, a bit of honeycomb wrapped in a leaf, a boy's first carved bird. The old idea of the wall began to learn a gentler burden, to be an instrument of care without forgetting its hard purpose, a knife that knew when to cut and when to lie quiet with its edge turned inward. Beyond it, where snowfields widen out like the palms of open hands, a new map was being made by footsteps. Villages of the free folk gathered where clear water ran and where driftwood was plentiful, and their houses rose quickly from bone and pole and sod, then slowly from timber and plank as the seasons allowed. In the evenings, women sang while working leather. Men laughed low over dice made from the ankle bones of deer and painted with ink from boiled alder cones. Children learned to read the sky because the sky had saved their grandparents, and learned letters too because letters had saved their friends. Marks scratched in birch bark practice sheets became words written in good ink on treated hide and valued like meat in hungry winters. Dogs lay at doors that opened without locks, and the older men taught the younger how to set snares that would not catch a fox kit by its paw. Sometimes, when the nights were clear and the green lights shifted overhead, people sat on sleds and watched the sky and spoke the names of those who were gone in voices that were not sad so much as steady. A man with a white wolf at his side walked out in front of such camps and came back again without ceremony. He taught even when he did not mean to teach. For him traps were set and left unsprung for the thin deer that had just enough strength to reach the next grove. For him a girl was sorted to a sled crew she had long wanted to join, and for him a boy was told for the first time that he had done well and meant it. He did not count himself as chief, though sometimes the people needed a word for what he was and used that one. He counted himself as a hand that drew back a curtain so that others could look out. Some nights he stood in the dark and made himself remember a pair of eyes that had been lost to fire and another pair that had met his without blame, and he came back to the tents with a mouth that knew how to be kind when kindness is not a performance but a quiet habit. In the west, a ship's wake laid silver on morning water, and a wolf sailed with a girl whose face had learned a dozen ways to be still and one way to be full of joy at the sight of a horizon no map had tried to own. Her crew grew around her like a family chosen rather than born. A cook who spoke 7 words of each of 7 languages but understood the word for hunger in all of them. A deckhand who could splice rope in a wind that blew laughter out of mouths and back into them again. A small woman with a talent for learning the manners of strange ports by watching how the cats lay in doorways. The ship did not always go forward. Sometimes it stood off and on while the girl studied currents as if they were script written by the moon. Islands showed themselves like thoughts that take time to be ready. One of black rock that rang when tapped, one of grass that waved as if it were answering a far call, one where birds nested in such numbers that the cliffs looked like they were moving. When storms came, she rode them wisely, for a good captain knows fear as a partner and not an enemy. When the sea went like glass, she told her crew small stories of fields where the snow glitters so strangely that you would think diamonds had fallen from a broken sky. In harbors where she did not speak the names of old houses aloud, she traded for silk that smelled faintly of smoke from a purple dye house, for spice that bit the mouth and made the heart beat happily, for a little book written right to left, which she learned to read on long noons while her crew slept in the shade of coiled sails. Sometimes her ship turned north and sometimes south. When it turned its prow toward home, it was not because she had been defeated by distance, but because a window had opened in her memory and called her to come back and tell the snow what the ocean had said. At Winterfell, the gods would grew in a way only apparent when you had seen enough years. The red leaves went through their clean cycle. The white trunk deepened its scars without complaint. Young trees were planted at the far edge where the grove opened toward the low sun, and the shepherd of the place, the face in the bark, took in their green whispers the way an old mind takes in the sound of new, honest learning. Women and men came and sat for long or short times, sometimes with questions they did not speak, sometimes with no questions at all because their hearts were held in decent balance and only wanted to be near an older balance. On autumn afternoons when the air had a taste to it like the memory of apples, you might see the queen walking there without furs, unhurried, as if to show the trees that she knew how to live at their pace. On some evenings when a raven had not returned from a distance and a message was due, you might see a boy's shape beneath the branches and then not see it, as if the forest had taken that boy into itself the way a sea takes a pebble tossed at just the right angle and keeps it for a while to make it smooth. The queen held winter courts that were neither harsh nor lenient. To the Northmen, justice that wanders is as useless as a smokehouse with holes in the roof. She sat in the great hall on days set aside for hearing. Casks of ale were kept sealed then, and the breath of the room came from people who were awake and sober to their needs. A man brought a complaint about a neighbor's fence that had crept like ivy. The queen listened, asked one question, then another, then instructed the men to go with a steward, measure, and return. When they returned, cold from the yard but flushed from being taken seriously, she gave judgment. The fence would move, the man who had moved it would supply the other with seed potatoes from the next harvest, and both would eat at Winterfell's table that night so that no one might call the day a bitter one. In this way small knots were undone as surely as larger ones had been cut by swords in other years, and the hall's air lost the old smell of fear that had once entered with men who did not expect fairness. In her seasons the North learned to be itself more comfortably. That is the most a reign can do when the land it holds was already old. Trade traveled by slower routes but surer ones, because roads maintained with care make more wealth than new treaties written in a hurry. Girls asked to learn their letters and were taught. Boys asked to mend instead of buy and were taught. The shepherds in the high pastures took to marking their nearest paths with cairns of piled stones, and when a traveler stopped and added a rock that matched the grain of those below it, the cairn seemed to nod in gratitude. There were still raids sometimes from men who believed the sea owed them what the land had denied, but the answers to such raids were given quickly and without unnecessary anger. Winter came as it must and found stores accounted for carefully enough that the wells of grain could be drawn on without panic. In the depth of those winters, a new kind of story took shape, the sort told by grandmothers when girls and boys were being kept awake long enough to muffle the bite of hungry stomachs before sleep. Those stories were not about kings with blazing swords. They were about stitches done evenly across a tear so fine that even the wearer would later forget where the cloth had failed. When the king in the south visited, the yard knew it in the simplest ways. Birds moved from parapet to parapet as if carrying quiet news. Cooks laid more loaves on the table as a habit of respect more than an answer to appetite. He came with little fuss and no parade. He touched the stones that knew him and watched a long while without moving, not because he was distant from what he saw, but because his seeing was work in itself. After a time he and his sister would walk together, not always speaking, and when they did speak their words were as plain as water. He would stay until some inner measure felt satisfied, then go again, leaving after him a feeling you might have if you had put a room to rights and then shut the door knowing it would stay decent for those who used it next. There were marriage feasts again after too many years of mourning wares. Trestle tables were set out, their legs steady on packed earth swept until it showed lines like a well-combed beard. Garland ropes were twisted from late wildflowers and from ribbons that had been kept in chests for such a day. The bride wore what she chose. Sometimes it was wool that glowed with the calm sheen of being well woven. Sometimes it was something borrowed and plain worn with eyes that made the cloth finer. The groom stood and put his hand in hers at the right moment without looking at his feet to find courage. The vows were spoken, not shouted. The feast began with a single sensible toast to the work the two would do together. Later, when the lamps burned low and the musicians had left off repeating their cleverest tune, an old woman would step forward and speak a blessing that sounded like a recipe. Flour, salt, thyme, water, patience. And when she finished, the room breathed out as one. Old names of the North breathed too. Umber, Serwyn, Glover, Tallheart, Mormont, Manderley, Reed. They were not simply banners but directions on a compass that had been used so long the needle knew what truth felt like. From the neck came reed boats with their shallow drafts, skimming across the foin in a way that made southern men's eyes widen. The Cranach folk taught a few in Winterfell's yard how to move without leaving a mark, and though the lesson seemed like a trick at first, its deeper meaning grew better understood in time. The land is not only what you take from it, it is what you leave behind unbroken. From the Bar Rollins came stories of kings buried with iron at their feet and bread at their hands, and the children who listened learned that honor feeds you even when you cannot chew. From the White Knife came casks that smelled like deep water, tar, and the faint sweetness of grains stored correctly through months that would have spoiled them if a single window latch had failed. The Boltons did not send anything. Their name spoke its own cautionary tale, which is a kind of contribution, if a bitter one. From the Riverlands word drifted up often of fields planted too close to old battle lines and then planted again because the earth will take seed from men who have forgiven more than they forget. From the Vale came young men and women with raptor's eyes and high manner. Some stayed and learned to check that manner against the humility stone houses ask for. The Stormlands sent storms, as was their nature, but also, sometimes, a cart of oranges that seemed like sunlight that had decided to grow skin and be held. The Reach sent drought once and an apology in the form of knowledge about water wheels. The North accepted both with equal grace. The Westerlands sent minstrels who wanted to trade songs for shelter and then for wine. They left with more shelter than wine and wrote better songs for it. The capital sent requests for lumber, and lumber went by consent and by rule, not by pressure. The letters that authorized the felling were written at a desk that had a view of distant black trees, and the man signing them was careful to sign fewer than he could have, saying, when asked, that cutting too much in his generation made him a thief from his grandchildren. In Winterfell's cellars, a new room was put aside to hold records of such small decencies. The maester, who wore his chain as if it were warm rather than cold, took a special delight in that room, and in the neatness of its shelves and in the little labels tied to the strings of the bundles. He taught his apprentices that the realm's health lives in such tidy bundles as surely as it lives in victories, and told them, when they were tempted to look down on a sack of barley as unnoble, to fast for a day and then smell a loaf when it is first cut. They learned quickly. They were good apprentices. Sometimes wind came hard down out of the far north with a sound like a long sigh from a sleeping animal, and when it did, the bells on Winterfell's walls made a different sound, less like a call than like a reassurance. People drew cloaks higher and went about their tasks with their chins tucked, and when they looked up, the sight of the castle's line against the sky gave them the same feeling you get when you put your hand on a table that does not wobble. The smith forged hinges as often as he forged blades, and he took equal pride in both. Hinge making is the art of making movement reliable. Men who have seen too many swords come apart admire hinges more than they say. Children were born whose first yawn was greeted by mothers with tears that were not only about pain and relief but about astonishment at being alive at the still point after so much spinning. Names were chosen with more thought than fashion. A girl called Lyra learned to sing as if she were weaving, each sound laid into the next with a touch you could not see but could feel. A boy called Ben carved birds so delicately that when they were hung in a murmuring draft, they moved the minds of people watching toward quiet. A child called Jory limped from a fever and learned to read in the afternoons while other children ran, and later taught letters to those who had never been given them because a limp and a book together make a person watch the world closely. Each new child seemed to bring with them into the house a slightly different shade of hope, and the grown folk felt it and made room for it at table. Not all days were clean. There were small betrayals and blunders, accidents that spared no man's pride. A year when rain came in mean spits that ruined hay, and another year when a sickness took the lambs before they could stand firmly. There were arguments about where a line lay between two fields because that line had been set by a man who had died and been misunderstood. There were words spoken in heat that should not have been spoken. In those times, men and women remembered what the house had taught them without noise. That fear is a poor lawmaker, that anger is a fast horse that runs past the turnoff, and that apologies are tools, not performances. The Queen apologized first more often than her counselors thought necessary. In doing so, she taught them what a human voice sounds like when it chooses the better path. In the crypt, sculptors learned again to make stone look like a person seen in good light. The new statues did not wear crowns or carry symbols larger than their hands could hold. They bore the everyday signs of a life done with care. A roll of plans under an arm, a small book bound in dogskin, a glove with mender's stitches neat along the finger. Wolves at their feet were carved with less ferocity and more watchfulness. Tapers burned there without being counted as waste. Children agreed to behave and then did not because that is what children do, but they quieted in the presence of the stone people in a way that felt like a promise to themselves rather than fear of correction. The stairs to the crypt were swept more often than the steps to any other place in the keep. The dust that gathered was its own kind of record, fine as ash, pale as flour, drifting in from a world that does not forget to be busy. Sometimes men came to the hall who had served the old house in younger days and were let to sit a while, their cloaks steaming near the south hearth. They spoke under their breath to one another and then were invited to speak aloud. They told a story or two and then stopped, feeling the border between their time and the new time. A careful listener could hear in those pauses a humility that did not show itself often in old men. They were not there to be reassured that their years had meant more than anyone else's. They were there to see with their own eyes that the house was a thing that could be trusted to keep going. They left warmer and lighter than they arrived and slept deeper that night than they had in months. Far out on the ice of a late winter, a boy and a girl went fox hunting with a hawk whose eye was the sharpest thing alive. The snow squeaked under their shoes the way it does when the cold is honest and uncomplicated, and the hawk rose and fell like a thrown knife coming to hand again. They did not catch the fox because the fox had had more practice being a fox than they had being hunters. They stood a while and were not disappointed. The girl wrote later that the point of the day had not been to win. The boy did not write, but remembered the day so well that when he was an old man he could still tell the exact smell of the hawk's feathers when it shook itself on his glove and drew the cold deeper into its body. A summer came hot enough to make the kitchen yard a place of shimmering air, and in that heat a caravan arrived from the reach with wheels that had to be watered so the rims would not loosen. They brought apples that tasted like green light and books bound in soft leather that smelled like the rooms they had once been read in. The queen bartered hard, not because she coveted what they offered, but because she knew the sellers would respect a fair partner more than an easy one. When they left, both sides had the sensation that comes when you wash your hands and the water runs not quite clear and then clear. The work is done, and it was worth doing. A week later, a storm rolled in from the west carrying thunder in its basket. It hammered the roofs and then passed, leaving behind a sky washed so clean the moon seemed freshly minted. The king's ravens brought tidings from the south and sometimes questions. The north answered in its own time. It had learned again that haste is sometimes violence in a polite suit. On a day in late autumn word came that a child of the islands had learned to write her name in a script from far away. A reply went back with a smile in it, saying only, "Send her north when she is ready, we will give her more names to write." On a day in high summer word came that the capital needed wood for new piers and did not know where to cut without starving villages of shade. The answer was a map annotated in a hand that was fond of margins. "Cut here, but leave these. Plant here to shelter lambs. Do not take the blackwood, it remembers too well." News of Arya reached Winterfell rarely and in strange wrappings. A shell came once with a hole drilled through it so that when you held it to your ear it spoke a sea word that no one could translate but everyone understood. A small bundle of paper cuttings came bound up in twine. Sketches of birds no one in the north had seen, a rough outline of a coastline that looked like a smile, a note that said only, in an unsteady hand as if the ship had been rocking, "The sun here rises behind me." Years later, a sailor came to White Harbor with a story about seeing a ship with a prow carved like a wolf slipping between islands as if it were moving through tall grass. He could not say more than that. It was enough. Where some families ask for letters every week as proof against forgetting, the North asked only for signs. At a loved one's work continued. Such signs were considered generous. On a morning in a small spring, a girl from the Crannigs stood in the yard and looked at the stones as if they were people she had just met and was deciding whether to love. She carried a spear that floated in her hand the way a reed floats in current and wore a fish spine charm at her throat. She had come to serve, as her father had promised in a whisper under boughs when the world was absurd with heat and fear. The yard looked back at her. Someone handed her a cup of small beer and a heel of bread. She put her back to the wall and ate, and in those moments a new thread stitched itself into the cloth without anyone needing to name the pattern it belonged to. The older stories, the ones that smelled of peat smoke and some wild, clean bitterness, were told less in the great hall and more by the edges of fields while people's hands were busy. There was one about a king who burned his ships to forbid his own temptation toward a kind of pride that leads men away from home. There was another about a lady who rode through winter and summer collecting names for the snows. Each year she returned and whispered the choicest to the wind right before the first frost. And that is why the snow falls with such varied textures and colors to it when the light catches each flake right. There was the story of the man who could see through trees and then learned to see through time and then learned to see through grief. The tone of these tales was not a lecture's tone. They did not insist. They were offered, and the listener picked up what lay close to their own heart and left what did not. As a person sifting small stones from a streambed picks up only the inches that flash exactly right. The people of White Knife and Long Lake and Last Hearth and Lean Skagos made a habit, slowly and then suddenly, of meeting once each year at a fair where nothing was truly for sale and everything was exchanged. A man from the Barrows brought a shovel with a handle polished by his grandfather's hands and taught 3 boys how to stand while working so their backs would not fail. A woman from the islands brought hooks that would not break even if a gull tried to carry off a fish bigger than the hook. The Crannock folk brought herbs for stitches and a kind of cloth that repelled water without needing oil, and they kept their ways but not their distance. There was a man from Torrens Square with a collection of songs about grain milling. He sang them and people listened with the patience the subject deserved. The Queen sent pastries with a thick glaze that cracked under teeth in a way that made even old men happier than they expected to be. Toward evening, an old wrestler from the rills demonstrated how to fall. It was a gift more useful than gold. Years rolled their edges smooth. The youngest in the house grew taller and the tallest grew thickened with the kind of strength that makes faces kinder. A girl went off to learn with a healer and came back knowing where to cut and where to bind and taught everyone that to warm a person with cold hands you must warm their chest first, not their extremities. A boy learned to make hinges that did not squeak in winter because he carved a sliver of soap into the barrel of each pin. And when he told the smith what he had done, the smith laughed and kissed the top of his head. The Queen's hair gathered a few threads of snow in it and did not mind. The banners were washed so rarely that when they were washed, the water in the washtub ran gray with a decade of wind. The wolves in the woods moved like thoughts you try to catch and then decide to let go of. Their presence measured the health of the land in a way men agreed to respect again. Men came from the south sometimes with the sharp eyes of those who still expected to find enemies behind doors, and after a week in the north they learned to widen their gaze. They learned that not every silence is a trap, and that a quiet table can be the strongest place in a house. They learned to take their boots off before entering certain rooms because a woman who ordered a floor to be cleaned of winter grit and then wiped again until the boards shown had earned the right for those boards to be treated like the inside of a cup. They learned that to enter the Godswood at night was not a sinister thing but a calming one, and they returned home with a new habit of standing at their own door in the evening to breathe the air and listen, without asking it to tell them anything. When asked back in their own places what the North was like, they said, "At last, it is like putting your hand on your own heartbeat and finding it strong but not hurried. It is like believing a person when they tell you the truth the first time they tell it." A winter harsher than most came on the heels of a summer kinder than it had a right to be. The contrast made people foolish at first. They had forgotten, as a slack muscle forgets, the quiet hard work of endurance. The Queen had the grain counted again, then again by another. The barns were sealed with seals made of clay pressed with her ring and marked each with a small sketch of the animal standing guard over that barn. A pig, a bee, a fox, a crow with a cocked head. People saved the sketches on scraps when the clay seals broke because the small pictures felt like the right kind of magic. In that winter, a wagon train of free folk came down with meat to trade for cloth and iron, and they were met not with mistrust but with relief and exact scales. Some had ravens perched on crossbeams over the heads of the leading dogs. The birds were eventually fed and took their pay in fat, as they always do. Fires were banked early. Midwives stood watch in turns. In the worst week, when the light was a lazy traveler, a young man lit a small candle in every window of the keep at dusk and went back to bed exhausted in a happiness he could not explain. The candles made a crown of light around the house, and after that, whenever winter came too hard, children asked if the lights would be lit again. There were funerals. There always are. The North does not skip them, even when the dead are not important by most measures. for the North has learned too thoroughly what happens when men decide that the unimportant can be set aside. A boy was carried out who had laughed when the snow gave way under his foot near a hidden brook because the cold felt like a dare from a wild friend. He had done everything right and the water had simply been stronger that day. A woman was carried out who had kept so many children alive with quick hands and a moving mind that Winterfell's steps seemed to count themselves in her name as her bier went down. A man was carried out who had never broken a promise to a neighbor and had only once broken an egg wrong, and then apologized to it. Each funeral bound the living to the house again as a nail binds wood to wood. The words spoken were plain and they held. A spring followed that harsh winter with a generosity that made old gardeners shake their heads and refuse to call it a blessing, not because they were ungrateful, but because they knew generosity can make a person careless. Seeds took. Bees swarmed so thick out of the old hives that a beekeeper stood grinning with tears in his beard as he coaxed them into new homes. The river ran fast but not dangerously. A girl who had been sick through the months of cold began to walk again under the watchful eye of a woman who refused to let her fall alone. It was in that spring that a small doe walked into the godswood and stood as if listening, and the men near her kept their bows low and let her keep listening until she had had enough and left. And after she left, the men looked at each other as if they had been taught something they did not yet have a word for. Letters came from the south that spoke of negotiations so long they had had to be measured in years. The replies were careful. The North had learned not to be hurried by men whose world was made of corridors that turned back on themselves. The Queen answered with a style that made some laugh sharp when it needed to be, softer when that would set the blade better. But not because it was clever, because it was true. When someone in her hall said once that she had a gift for diplomacy, she replied that what she had was a good memory and a desire to sleep at night. Men like to call that diplomacy, women call it work. The men in the room inclined their heads and tried to remember the lesson. On a day when the ground was damp with the travel of moles and the air smelled like turned earth, a boy sat under the heart tree and taught himself to breathe in time with the white trunk's strange, unhurried pulse. He was not of the house by blood, though he was of it by choosing and it of him by recognition. He thought he felt an old hand once on his shoulder, warm through the wool, and when he looked no one was there. He did not mention it to anyone, and the silence with which he kept that moment turned it into a tool he could take out when he needed to remember he was not alone. As the years stacked themselves neatly in the household's grain ledger, someone finally said aloud what everyone had begun to suspect privately. The house now measured time as a person measures sleep. There were quiet, long stretches, and then moments when a dream took you by the shoulders and made you pay attention. Then calm again. The measurement was not careless. It was a way of honoring how human beings actually endure. In that manner of counting, the Queen grew older without growing heavy, and those around her learned to carry more of the work, because good command teaches its own replacement long before the hand must let go of the reins. The king's ravens kept making their rounds. The night fires were banked and then woken. The rood screens in the small chapel by the yard were oiled so they did not splinter. The carving on the newel post at the main stair still smelled faintly of cedar when warmed by a hand sliding down it. Westward, the ship came home in a way that seemed like the natural continuation of an inhale rather than a return. It entered White Harbor at dawn with its sails lowered to show respect to the harbor's habit of fog. And when it came alongside the quay, a long line of gulls lifted, scolding, as if the ship had woken them from a good dream. The woman who walked down the gangplank wore travel the way some wear jewelry. It caught the light when she turned. She did not make a show of her return, but the city could not help making a show of seeing her. People with fish knives in their hands stopped mid-cut. A boy dropped a melon and laughed as it split. An old man set his pipe down and wept. She went to the great house without needing to be led and sat with her sister in a room where the windows breathed heat, and together, without trying, they set the old shape right again by fitting into it as if it had been built for precisely this. After a time, the sea called once more, as it always will to those who have answered it properly, and she went back to where currents write their unending, complicated letter, this time with 3 apprentices whose eyes worked as hard as their hands. In a small village near the Wolfswood, a man built a school that did not look like a school because schools in the north do better when they look like barns that happen to have letters in them. He hired a woman from the south whose father had been a mason and a man from the island whose mother had taught him to fight bears by frightening them with the seriousness of his posture. And together they taught children to read and to stand. The children learned farm accounts in the morning and spear grips in the afternoon, and then the other way round in winter. They learned that maps can lie if they do not include the smell of the places they describe. On the last day of each month, they read aloud the old words that had kept the North decent, just to hear how they sounded in a small room with smoke in the rafters. The sound was good. It made the boards on the floor feel satisfied with being walked on. From time to time, a stranger came with a story that many wanted to disbelieve because it did not fit. The house took such stories and did not mock them. A woman said she had seen a light under the ice where a river goes under a rock and that it had spoken, not in words, but in a feeling like the good beginning of a meal. A man said he had dreamed of a wolf with a man's eyes who had led him back to a camp when he was lost in a storm. A child said she had heard the gods would sigh the way a sleeping thing sighs when it has been turned over gently. The stories were set down with others and marked as unproved, and the marking did not shame them. The North had learned the difference between gullibility and hospitality. When the day came for the queen to lay aside the weight of daily choosing, the house did not sharpen itself with fear. Familiar hands took up familiar tasks. The great hall filled and emptied like a lung. A feast was held without the tragic edge that such feasts sometimes carry. It tasted instead like a table set after harvest, with the right number of places and the right number of knives. She stood and spoke and did not make more of herself than a person should, and by refusing the drama she saved the people around her from that peculiar hunger it breeds. The one who followed her to the high seat did so with eyes made wiser by long looking, and the house took the measure of that person and found it good. The gods would held its peace. The ravens kept their routes. The winter words were spoken and did not feel like a warning. They felt like a reminder of the shape of the year. In the seasons that followed, the northern habit of long attention deepened. Men learned to read the change in a dog's tail and take from it what they needed to avoid a fight at the gate. Women learned to read the change in a man's voice when sorrow had gone from hard to healing and then turned the talk to timber or tea at just the right moment. Children learned to respect a tool that is sharp and to admire a tool that is dull but does its job perfectly. The house learned again not to waste anger on things that cannot be altered, and not to waste energy pretending things that can be altered are fixed. On the nights when snow fell thickest and the moon made a clean path on the white, a patrol would sometimes walk the wall in pairs and not talk at all, and when they came down from the steps their faces would be calm in a way that made the fire look more friendly than it had before. Through that time, the old cave under the earth where roots knit themselves like patient fingers kept its hum, which is a feeling more than a sound. The boy who had learned to time his breath there grew into a man who took on tasks that frightened him and did them well, because fright is not failure, and later became a man who taught a girl to hold a hawk and not flinch when it stared at her with gold and indifference. A Cranagman came and went. A Bear Islander came and stayed. A woman from the Reach married a man whose hands were always cold and learned the technique for warming them that was not romantic but effective. Coarse wool and the rubbing of the back rather than the fingers. These are small things, but a house only stays a house because of small things done well over and over until doing them well is a habit that feels like love. Stories did not stop being told of the night that tried to end the world. The telling, however, shifted. The children learned less about terror and more about the way those alive turned their fear into a line of people sharing breath and warmth. The heroines and heroes did not become smaller. They became nearer. When a child asked how the dead can be beaten, a woman said, "The same way hunger is beaten, with neighbors and fire." When another asked if such a night could come again, a man said, "It can, and if it does we will do what we did before, which is not to pretend that we are brave, but to act as if others deserve our courage." This answer, simple and sufficient, was written into children's bones by the repetition of breakfasts and chores and evenings. Toward the earlier part of one spring, a boy in White Harbor sat by the water and drew maps with a piece of charcoal on a board someone had thrown away. He drew the known lands until there was no more board left to draw on. He turned the board and drew the sea not as emptiness but as a field of curves that suggested where a ship might find a friend in a wind. When he had filled every edge, He looked up and found an old fisherman watching him with a smile that showed he had lost a tooth long ago for reasons he could not remember. The fisherman took him to a woman who taught him to draw with ink and brush, and years later that boy sent north a set of new charts of the waters west of the world, and they were placed in the record room where the maester kept his gentle order. The charts smelled faintly of fish and considered decision. There was a string of years when the wolves were seen more often, and those who watched such things wrote that it was because the rabbits had bred better after certain fires had cleared the underbrush and the roots had gotten more light. In those years people dreamed more often of running through snow without their feet touching it. The dreams left them happier than fear dreams do, and they woke to their work with an ease that had more to do with gratitude than with hope. Some called the dreams a blessing and others didn't name them at all, which was a way of blessing them without risking the spell. At times the world pressed in with a demand for noise. It is the habit of distant courts to mistake volume for importance and urgency for truth. The North answered with the deliberate pace of a man who has learned to carry slopping buckets without spilling and who knows that speed is often the enemy of completion. There were years when such poise was mistaken for stubbornness, and there were years when it was celebrated as wisdom. The North kept doing its chores. The wheat was cut and then the stubble was turned under. The sheep were moved before the wolves were hungry, and when a wolf did take a lamb, the shepherd told the truth about his vigilance and accepted the loss as part of the arithmetic of a life among living things with needs. In this way the house continued, and because continuation is not dramatic, it can be mistaken for ease. It was not ease. It was attention, and attention is the hardest work there is when done without vanity. Men who came to Winterfell seeking spectacle found instead the comfort of tasks done well, and they left quieter than they arrived. Women who came seeking permission for some different life often found they had had permission all along and needed only to ignore the voice that told them otherwise. Children who came seeking heroes found them in the kitchen yard where two cooks had worked together for 27 years without a single day of shouting, and in the stable where a groom taught a boy to lift a hoof without frightening the horse or himself. And when the lights were drawn low and the last line of steam drifted from the bath where the spring shared its warmth upstairs with bone and skin, the heart of the house continued to beat at its old and steady rate. The fires died down and then were banked to a red so dim you could convince yourself you were watching breath itself. The ravens settled. Their feet tightened on their perches and their eyes closed with that secretive sleep birds own. The wolves in the wood moved to new beds with the soft thumps of bodies used to comfort. The watchman on the wall blew on his hands and spread his fingers against the stone and opened them again. Down in the crypt the last candle guttered and went, leaving behind a smell that always makes time feel respectful. The night held its silence as if it were holding a child. The house slept into it. The land lay under it. And the North, which is older than most of the world's boasting, kept its post without complaint, because that is what it was made for, and because love, at its best, is not the loud word shouted at the door but the quiet presence that sits awake when the others are asleep, listening for the sound that would mean trouble and readying the hand that knows which way to turn the latch.